Good morning, Sanctuary Covenant Church, and happy Easter. He is risen. He is risen indeed. I want to start out this morning just by acknowledging the strangeness of what we're experiencing right now. This is my 39th Easter, and to my knowledge, this is the first time in 39 years that I will not be physically present at church on Easter Sunday. And it's just weird for me. It feels strange to be talking to a camera and just trusting that you're going to be watching this on your phone or your laptop or your TV sometime tomorrow morning is just an odd experience. Some of you are in a similar boat to me. You've been going to church your whole life, and this is a unique Easter just because you've always been at church. Others of you have a different story. Maybe this is your first Easter of being part of a church, and everything feels new anyway. And no matter what, I just wanted to share this verse from you from the Apostle Paul in Colossians 2:5 because it expresses my heart this morning. For though I am absent from you in body, I am present with you in spirit, and delight to see how disciplined you are and how firm your faith in Christ is. And I'm just so thankful for Sanctuary Covenant Church, for all the ways that all of us have been connecting together during this time. And I can't wait for the Sunday when we all get to be together again and share hugs and hellos and eat snacks together and all those things that we love doing. But with that, let's jump right into the sermon. So last week my dad made a post on Facebook, and my dad doesn't post a lot on Facebook, and so when he does, I read them. And honestly, my first response when I read his post was, "Come on, Dad, why'd you have to go and ruin my day like that?" And I'm sure that no one else ever has that experience to a family member's post where you looked at it and it just like ruined your day, because I'm sure just nobody has that experience. But that was my experience reading my dad's post. But then the more I thought about it and I reread it, the more I appreciated his post. You see, my dad is in his 60s and thankfully is rigorously following the shelter-in-place guidelines at my parents' home in Washington State. But this is what he wrote, and I did get permission to share it with you. He wrote this right in the midst of this global pandemic that we're all weathering. He said, "I was thinking about dying this morning. Don't think me morbid, just pensive. I was sitting with the Lord, no devices, no distractions, and I thought about this pandemic and the fact that people my age are most at risk. I asked the Lord, what if you call me home in the next week? What could this week be like for me?" And he and I wandered to comforting places in my imagination. Someone posted on Facebook a quote from C.S. Lewis as he contemplated World War II and the Cold War. What does war, or in our case the virus, do to death? It certainly does not make it more frequent. 100% of us die, and the percentage cannot be increased. It can put several deaths earlier, but I hardly suppose that is what we fear. Yet war does something to death. It forces us to remember it. War makes death real to us, and that would have been regarded as one of its blessings by most of the great Christians of the past. The person who posted this went on to say, "I know that may sound a bit morbid, but when you resolve yourself to the reality of death, you can start to use whatever amount of time you have, whether 6 months or 20 years or 60 years, to embrace life and capitalize on whatever opportunities God has put in front of you." That is where my mind went this morning with Jesus, and it was surprisingly comforting. Whatever comes, I will always be with the one who loves me most. So I don't live in fear, but only in expectation and a desire to be attentive to the presence of God now. I think that is a wonderful truth for us to meditate on. Whatever comes, we will always be with the one who loves us most, and that is Jesus. And that enables us to live without fear, to live only in expectation of and desire to be aware of the presence of God in our lives. I think it's a particularly significant insight to meditate on during the pandemic and an appropriate place to begin our celebration of Easter and the resurrection of Jesus today. As of 4 p.m. on Friday, the CDC reported that there have been around 460,000 cases of COVID-19 in the US, and over 16,000 people have died. Now, depending on who you ask, this disease could wind up killing anywhere from 60,000 to 250,000 Americans. Not to even get into what that's going to look like worldwide. It says something about the severity of the crisis that when we hear it may only be 60,000, we feel like that's good news. In our church, though no one, as far as I'm aware, has tested positive for COVID-19, we have had several prayer requests shared for friends and family members who've tested positive. And as part of that, there's a very real possibility that before this is all over, some of us will have lost loved ones. And even if those predictions turn out to be false or an overreaction, we will all surely continue experiencing the grief of a lost way of life, a lost normal as we shelter in place and deal with the financial hardships of this time. There's grief involved. So I think it would do us well to ask the question, how should we respond to grief in light of Easter? Both in general, but then specific to this situation, when a loved one dies, when we face our own death, how do we respond to death, to grief, to coming face to face with our own mortality? Do we bottle it up and shove it down until a more opportune time to deal with it? Do we express it all right now, broadcasting it over the airwaves of Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter? Do we look on the bright side and keep a positive attitude, focusing only on the positive side of things, like some sort of Pollyanna? In the church, an appropriate question to ask along with this is, well, what did Jesus do? How does Jesus react to the death of a loved one? And fortunately, in that regard, we are not left in the dark. So if you haven't already done so, pause this video and either watch the story of Lazarus or read John chapter 11, 1 through 44. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, so I expect you to do that on your own this morning before continuing with this message. Now, I know, it is Easter Sunday, and I'm supposed to be preaching on Jesus' resurrection, not Lazarus' story, and I promise we will get there. But this story speaks to how Jesus himself handled grief, and it just so happens to include the seventh of Jesus' I am statements in the Gospel of John, which we've been focusing on during the season leading up to Easter. And so I wanted to begin with this story and frame our understanding around the story of Lazarus, and then talk about how it connects to Jesus' resurrection. So the Lazarus story tells about how Jesus hears about his friend Lazarus getting sick and eventually dying, and then it tells of Jesus going to the funeral, having a brief conversation, and then canceling the rest of the funeral by raising Lazarus from the dead. It's hard to continue with your wake when the dead person is eating all the snacks. So along the way, there's some great moments, like when Jesus tells them to roll away the stone, and Martha responds, "But Lord, by this time there is a bad odor." This is one of the reasons that I love the Bible. It doesn't shy away from the unpleasant and very realistic details. But I do want to focus on three aspects of Jesus' response that I think have deep meaning and application for us today. So the first is this. When faced with grief and loss and death, the first thing Jesus does is he responds with presence. Jesus responds with presence. In Jewish culture, when a family member died, the deceased was typically buried on the same day. In addition, the first week of deep grief after a close relative's burial would be spent mourning in one's house, sitting on the floor, and visited by friends. This custom, called Shiva, for 7 days, is still practiced in Judaism today and is very helpful for releasing grief. When Lazarus died, Jesus responded by showing up, by being present with his other grieving friends. Shiva wasn't about giving advice or speaking platitudes, but simply being present together during grief for an extended period of time, for 7 days straight. Unfortunately, American culture is so uncomfortable with grief that we often try and move past it too quickly. We hastily plan a funeral, spend an hour sharing stories, and then go on with our lives and everything gets back to normal. But those who've experienced grief know that there is no getting back to normal. An hour-long funeral doesn't do the trick. Neither, realistically, does 7 days. But a prolonged period of time of paying attention to grief and being present to one another makes it a lot more bearable and helps us to process grief in a healthier way. If we follow Jesus' example, I think that we'll spend a little more time just being present to grief, to our own grief, to the grief of others, and present with each other during those times. The second thing Jesus does is he responds with empathy. Jesus responds with empathy. This story contains the shortest verse in the Bible, John 11:35. It was my favorite back as a kid when we had to memorize scripture verses and we would get points and rewards for how many we memorized. Every kid that I knew memorized this verse because, well, it was the easiest one to memorize. John 11:35. Jesus wept. It's an important verse because it reminds us that even though Jesus was God incarnate, fully divine, he was also fully human. Jesus felt things. He felt things deeply. There are entire sermons out there about Jesus weeping, but I'll just say this. The fact that Jesus weeps means that Jesus empathized with Mary and Martha in their loss of a brother. He felt the loss himself. He allowed himself to go there. We are wise to do the same. Finally, Jesus responds with hope. When Martha pressures Jesus to intervene, he responds by saying, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" And then, as proof that the resurrection Jesus offers, the power over death that he claims, is not just empty words, he raises Lazarus from the dead. Ultimately, as final proof and vindication, Jesus himself dies and is resurrected by God. And then, and this is unique to Jesus over Lazarus, he doesn't ever die again. And this is what we celebrate on Easter, Jesus' resurrection that is never followed by death. Resurrection means that we will live even if we die. It is the promise and the meaning of Easter. It's why we celebrate this day every single year. It's why I haven't missed church in 39 years. Death, that greatest of foes, has been vanquished by Jesus. He took it into himself. He nailed it to his cross. He buried it in his grave. And then he triumphed over it by coming back to life. Jesus, in his death and resurrection, broke the power of death and promised resurrection to all who come to him. Friends, this is the meaning of Easter, and it's a guide for how we can respond when faced with these frightening, anxiety-producing times. Death, as C.S. Lewis said, eventually comes for all of us. But Jesus, by raising Lazarus from the dead and by being raised from the dead himself, proves that death doesn't have the final word. It's true what my dad wrote. Whatever comes, I will always be with the one who loves me most. So I don't live in fear, but only in expectation and a desire to be attentive to the presence of God now. Jesus ends his statement about being the resurrection and the life by asking Martha, "Do you believe this?" I think that he's asking each and every one of us the exact same question. Do you believe? Do you believe that Jesus has power over death? Do you believe that he will never abandon or forsake you? Do you believe that he can be trusted during frightening times? No, I don't think that he asks this as some sort of guilt trip or litmus test, but as an encouragement. That if you have even a mustard seed sized faith in this, take comfort in it and invite Jesus to increase your faith. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Death has no power over you. Yes, we will all die someday, but death cannot and will not separate us from the one who has always been by our side. Happy Easter.